In this video, I'll be building a habitat not just for one animal, but for two that I didn't know could be in the same enclosure. The Asian small-clawed otter and the gibbon. Watch me struggle with this habitat as I try to create a climbing adventure above the guests, as well as an underwater viewing area for the otters. The Asian themed habitat is a perfect starting point for an Asian section in our zoo. Welcome back to another community zoo episode. In the last episode, we built a red river hog habitat as part of our first Africa section. This time, we've added the otter, as suggested by Aaron Felton. Thanks. However, I did add the gibbon because I really wanted to build that overhead section, and I was surprised that these two could actually easily share an enclosure. Don't forget to let me know in the comments what animal you would like to see next. Alright, let's get started. As always, we want to outline where our habitat is going to be. In this case, I wasn't quite sure what it was going to look like, so instead of just starting with a barrier, I began by caving in the ground to create a pool for the otters. Next, I added a path beside it to visualize where I might place the underwater viewing area. I also started working on the building to outline what the backside of the habitat would look like. This time I focused not just on the barrier, but also on modifying the terrain, the pathing and the building that would house the otters, to establish the full vision of the habitat, even before actually placing the barriers. I started by digging a hole and lowering the path into the ground to create this underwater viewing space. The terrain and pathing system in Planet Zoo can be tricky to work with, but I covered up the rough spots with rocks to make it look better. I figured starting with an underwater viewing area would be the most challenging part, so I tackled that first. Now, dealing with glass panels overlapping steep terrain can be finicky. It took a few tries, but eventually I got it to work. Here's a tip. If you want to fill the habitat with water and there is a glass viewing area, it usually works fine, but you can't really get the water on the same level as the glass planes. What you need to do is make them bigger, then place the glass and then lowering them down. This method almost creates an infinity pool effect with the glass, which looks much better. While working on the viewing area, I finished it by placing stones at the bottom and then added some grates to handle any water that might spill over the edge, adding a touch of realism. After that, I added some fences left over from the other habitat, the red river hogs, to continue the style. This was just a rough outline of the habitat. Then I continued with the actual building itself, placing a floor in it, which is something I normally don't do, but in this case it worked well. I'm not much of a builder, I'm more into landscaping, and I didn't put much effort into this building, so you could probably do a lot better. Next, I finished up the habitat barrier. Except for the glass windows, all of the other barriers were empties. I added a door to the habitat, replaced the wall, and then the building was pretty much done. We now have a working habitat with a barrier. I began decorating the building a bit, adding pillars for little extra details, even though, as I mentioned, I wasn't going to add much to this building. Then I added a roof, using the construction assets from the Asian pack. I wanted to add more detail, but I just couldn't be bothered. Maybe in the next video I'll focus more on building details. Now that we're almost done with the base of the habitat, let me explain the plan. As I said, we wanted to have the gibbons, and I want them to climb over the habitat into the area where visitors walk into the zoo. An overhead climbing section would look amazing. So let's start by adding the gibbons and the otters to the habitat to see how much they can move around, where they might escape, and where we need to improve. First, I tested if the gibbons could escape, and fortunately they couldn't. However, they couldn't really climb the tree and vine I set up, so I just added another pole to see if they could actually climb the tree. They could, but they can now also escape. I tested further by placing the vine over the habitat's edge to see what would happen, and yes, technically they could escape, which is not what we wanted. So the only solution I had was to expand the habitat barrier into the entrance. This expansion meant that people would be walking into the habitat, and I wonder if this would be an issue, but it wasn't. As long as the animals couldn't reach the guests, it was fine. Because some otters were still escaping, I built a small wooden barrier across the glass planes and then added a stone rim around the entire habitat. Once that was done, they could no longer escape, and I could continue on with the climbing structures. Returning to the gibbons, I wanted an overhead climbing area, but I didn't want to build it from scratch. So I took one of the pre-made climbing structures, rotated it upside down, and attached it to the ceiling. I then adjusted it to work with the vines that I've already set up, and I also added a wooden structure at the beginning to avoid having just one pole where the gibbons would climb up. After setting everything up, I noticed that they could climb in the structure above the guests, which looked very nice. I also attached a vine to the front entrance where the guests enter, providing an extra bit of walking space for the gibbons. And initially this worked well. The gibbons climbed up and enjoyed the space, but after a while they stopped using it and I couldn't figure out why. This issue became a major problem for me later in the video, but for now everything looked great. With the guests pouring in while I was building, it was a bit annoying, so I closed the zoo and put most of the animals back into the animal center, and then continued on working on the habitat's environmental aesthetic. I made the underwater viewing area look a lot better with stones and rocks. And then moved on to adding scrubs, grasses, and trees. As for the biome, I wasn't inspired by a particular one. Maybe a bit of mangrove with lots of ferns, but I just went with what looks good. The small island in the middle was covered with plants, which I thought would be most realistic, but I removed some later. I added some bamboo because, well, you can't really have an Asian themed habitat without it. I covered the ground with various types of vegetation, using different heights of grasses to create variation, which I think looks both nice and very realistic. and it started to look really nice. Next, I covered the edge of the water with stones because the slope didn't seem realistic enough to me. I added a rocky edge to that section using smaller faux rocks to blend in the stones with the ground, which just looks so much better. After finishing the ground textures with a mix of dark soil, light soil, stones and grasses, I added the essentials like enrichments and bedding for the animals. I also changed the path to a more bamboo themed look, which I think fits very nicely. However, I became so frustrated with the gibbons that stopped using the front part of the habitat, and after struggling with it for over 30 minutes, I just gave up and started building a bridge. I hoped the bridge would actually fix the climbing issue by providing another entry point to the depth tree. The bridge just didn't solve the problem, but it did look cool, so I decided to keep it. Another major issue, the gibbons and otters didn't have enough walking space. I tried to use the bridge to increase the area of land, but it just wasn't enough. Eventually, I decided I need to add more land. After adding a lot more land, I then checked again and it was still insufficient. So I detailed the new area with some stones, added the jetty to increase the walking space for the otters and gibbons, and it was still barely enough, but I just had to move on. Sorry. Next, I replaced the original climbing structures with a mangrove apple tree, which looks better and made the habitat look more natural. The gibbons could still climb it, and I aligned it with the vines so they could hop from the tree to the vine, which just worked fine. Finally, I figured out what the problem was. For some reason, not all objects on the climbing structure were climbable, and I don't know why. But I fixed this and everything just worked as expected. Although they could now escape, I did place a glass barrier on top to prevent escapes and moved it to the front, which seemed to solve the issue. Now the gibbons could no longer escape, but they could access this new section of land, which also fixes the walkable surface issues as well. I added enrichment and bedding for them to relax above the gas, which just looks fun. Me as a guest, I would have a wonderful time in this entrance and it would really add to the aesthetic of the zoo. And just look at the gibbon, happy and relaxed on the vine above the guests. I added some last minute details including enrichments like a block of fruit, a bamboo stick, and at this point the habitat was complete. I'm really curious to know what you think of it. Personally, I'm very happy with it, even though it was a bit of a struggle. It took me about 2 hours to build, but I'm really happy with the final result. Let me know in the comments what animal you would like to see added to the zoo next, and I can't wait to continue building this zoo. Thank you for watching, subscribe if you like it, and I'll see you next time.